Welcome to the channel, Life of Slaves. Today's story is from 1854. Gideon Vance. He was a black boy who painted like Leonardo da Vinci. No one could explain it, no teacher, no master, no record. This is a heavy story. Take a breath. Listen carefully. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and write in the comments the city and country you're listening from. Your presence keeps these stories alive instead of forgotten. Let's begin. In the summer of 1854, something happened in Charleston, South Carolina that no historian has ever been able to fully explain. On June 17th of that year, inside the grand ballroom of the Planters Hotel on Meeting Street, over 200 of the most powerful people in the American South gathered for what they believed would be a celebration. They came dressed in their finest clothes. The men wore tailored suits imported from London. The women wore silk gowns that cost more than most families earned in a year. They drank French champagne and ate oysters brought fresh from the coast that very morning. They were there to honor a young white man named Thomas Ashworth, who at just 24 years old had become the most celebrated painter in the entire South. But by the end of that night, every single person in that room would witness something they could not unsee. A revelation so shocking that newspapers from Richmond to New Orleans would carry the story on their front pages. A truth so uncomfortable that powerful men would spend years trying to bury it. And at the center of it all was not Thomas Ashworth, but a 17-year-old enslaved boy whose name most of those guests had never heard spoken aloud. His name was Gideon, and this is his story. To understand what happened that night in Charleston, we need to go back 14 years, to a cotton plantation 43 miles northwest of the city. The Ashworth plantation covered nearly 3,000 acres of prime Carolina low country. In 1840, it was home to 112 enslaved people who worked the fields from before sunrise until after dark. The plantation was owned by a man named Cornelius Ashworth, a third-generation planter whose family had grown wealthy from cotton and rice. Cornelius was known throughout the county as a hard man. Not cruel in the theatrical way some slaveholders were, but cold, calculating. He saw the people he owned as investments, nothing more. He tracked their births and deaths in the same leather ledger where he recorded the purchase of new plows and the sale of cotton bales. In March of 1840, an enslaved woman named Ruth went into labor in one of the small wooden cabins that lined the dirt path behind the big house. Ruth was 22 years old. She had been purchased by the Ashworth family when she was just 12, brought to the plantation from a slave market in Savannah. In the 10 years since, she had worked in the fields, then in the kitchen, and finally in the laundry. She was known for her quiet strength and her ability to endure whatever was placed upon her shoulders. The labor was difficult. It lasted almost 18 hours. The other women in the quarters did what they could for her, but there was no doctor, no medicine, no help beyond what their own hands and knowledge could provide. Just before dawn on March 14th, Ruth gave birth to a baby boy. He came into the world small but alive, his lungs strong enough to cry out into the cold morning air. Ruth held her son for less than an hour. She named him Gideon after a figure from the Bible she had learned about from the plantation's Sunday services. Then the bleeding that had started during the birth would not stop. By the time the sun rose fully over the Carolina pines, Ruth was gone. The baby Gideon was taken in by an older woman named Cora, who had already raised 6 children of her own on that plantation, 4 of whom had been sold away to other states. Cora fed the infant with milk from a rag and kept him alive through those first fragile weeks. She would later tell others that from the very beginning something about this child was different. He rarely cried. He watched everything with eyes that seemed too old for his small face. And when he was old enough to hold a stick, he began to draw. Gideon's father was a man named Solomon, who had been sold to a plantation in Mississippi just 2 months before Gideon was born. Solomon never knew he had a son. He died of fever in 1847 without ever learning that Ruth had been pregnant. This was a common tragedy in the world of American slavery. Families torn apart. Children growing up without ever knowing who their parents were, an entire system designed to break the bonds that hold people together. By the time Gideon was 5 years old, he was already working. This was normal for enslaved children on southern plantations. They were put to work as soon as they were physically able. Gideon's first job was to carry water to the field workers. He would walk back and forth from the well to the fields, a wooden bucket in each hand, all day long in the Carolina heat. By the time he was 7, he was assigned to the stables where he cleaned stalls, fed horses, and learned to make himself invisible. But at night, when his work was done and the overseers had gone back to their quarters, Gideon would find pieces of charred wood from the cooking fires. He would take these pieces of charcoal to a spot behind the old smokehouse where no one ever went. And there, on scraps of wood, on flat stones, on anything he could find, Gideon would draw. He drew the things he saw around him, the faces of the people in the quarters, the horses in the stable, the big house with its white columns, the oak trees with their hanging moss. He drew from memory, and he drew from imagination. And even though he had never been taught, even though he had never seen a real painting or met anyone who called themselves an artist, the images he created were remarkable. One evening in the spring of 1848, when Gideon was 8 years old, an old man named Ezekiel found the boy drawing behind the smokehouse. Ezekiel was in his 70s, one of the oldest enslaved people on the plantation. He had been born in Africa and brought to America on a slave ship when he was a young man. He had seen things in his life that he rarely spoke about. But when he saw what Gideon was doing, he stood very still for a long time. The drawing was of a woman's face. It was Ruth. Gideon had never seen his mother, but Cora had described her to him many times, the shape of her eyes, the way she smiled, the small scar on her chin from a childhood accident. Gideon had taken these descriptions and turned them into an image so lifelike that Ezekiel felt his heart stop. He had known Ruth. He had been there the night she died. And looking at that drawing was like seeing her ghost. Ezekiel knelt down beside the boy. He spoke carefully, knowing that what he was about to say was important. He told Gideon that what he could do was a gift, but he also told him that it was a dangerous gift. White folks, Ezekiel said, did not like to see black people do things they were not supposed to be able to do. If the master found out about these drawings, there was no telling what might happen. Ezekiel made Gideon promise to be careful, to keep his gift hidden, to only draw when he was sure no one was watching. Gideon promised, and for the next 3 years, he kept that promise. He continued to draw in secret, improving with each passing month. He found new materials to work with, berry juice for color, clay mixed with water for different shades of brown. He experimented with everything he could get his hands on. And with each experiment, his abilities grew. Meanwhile, life on the Ashworth plantation continued as it always had. Cornelius Ashworth ran his operation with cold efficiency. Cotton prices were good in the early 1850s, and the plantation was profitable. Cornelius had 2 children, a daughter named Elizabeth, who was married to a lawyer in Charleston, and a son named Thomas, who was 20 years old in 1850 and had recently returned from 3 years of schooling in Boston. Thomas Ashworth was not like his father. Where Cornelius was practical and focused on business, Thomas was interested in art and culture. He had spent his years in Boston attending lectures, visiting galleries, and trying to develop himself as a painter. He had some talent, the kind that comes from good instruction and expensive supplies. But deep down, Thomas knew he would never be great. He had the technique, but not the spark. His paintings were competent, but lifeless. They looked like copies of better work. This frustrated Thomas deeply. He had grown up being told he was special, that he was better than other people simply because of who his family was. The discovery that talent does not care about bloodlines or bank accounts was a bitter pill. Thomas returned to South Carolina with a chip on his shoulder and something dark growing in his heart. In the fall of 1851, something happened that would change everything. Thomas was walking near the old smokehouse one evening when he heard a sound. It was quiet, just a soft scratching noise, but it caught his attention. He followed the sound around the back of the building, pushing through the overgrown weeds. And there he found Gideon. The boy was 11 years old now. He was sitting on an overturned bucket, focused completely on what he was doing. In front of him was a large flat piece of pine bark, and on that bark was an image that stopped Thomas in his tracks. It was a landscape of the plantation at sunset. The big house was visible in the distance, with the field stretching out before it. The sky was rendered in shades of orange and purple that Thomas had never been able to achieve in his own work. The shadows felt exactly right. The perspective was perfect. And there was something else, something harder to define. The painting had feeling. It had life. Looking at it was like looking through a window at the real thing. Thomas did not speak. He could not speak. For a long moment, he just stood there, his mind trying to process what he was seeing. This was not possible. This child, this enslaved boy who had never seen the inside of an art gallery, who had never held a proper brush or studied with a master, was producing work that was better than anything Thomas had ever created. Gideon had frozen when he realized he was not alone. He knew he was caught. He expected punishment. He expected to be beaten or sold or worse. He had broken the unspoken rule of the plantation. He had revealed that he was more than what they said he was. But Thomas did not call for the overseer. He did not raise his voice or his hand. Instead, he knelt down and looked at the painting more closely. He asked questions. How long had Gideon been doing this? Where did he learn? Had anyone taught him? Gideon answered truthfully. He had been drawing since he was old enough to hold a stick. No one had taught him. He just saw things in his mind and put them down on whatever surface he could find. He did not know why or how. It was just something he could do. Thomas stood up slowly. His mind was working now, calculating in a way he had learned from his father. He saw an opportunity, a dark and twisted opportunity, but an opportunity nonetheless. He told Gideon that he would not report what he had found. He told the boy that his secret was safe, but there was a condition. From now on, Gideon would work for Thomas. He would create paintings that Thomas would claim as his own. In return, Gideon would be protected. He would be given better food, better clothes, and he would not be sold away from the plantation. Gideon was 11 years old. He had no power, no rights, no one to protect him. He understood even at that young age what was being offered. It was not freedom. It was a different kind of cage. But it was a cage that might keep him alive, that might keep him close to Cora and the few people he cared about. He agreed. What choice did he have? And so began one of the strangest and most hidden chapters in American art history. For the next 3 years, Gideon would create paintings in secret for Thomas Ashworth. He worked in a small room in the basement of the big house, a space that had once been used for storage. Thomas brought him real supplies, canvas, brushes, oils imported from Europe. He brought him books with reproductions of great paintings so Gideon could study the techniques of the masters. He brought him everything a young artist would need to develop their craft. And Gideon learned quickly. Within months, he had mastered techniques that took most artists years to develop. He understood light and shadow instinctively. He could capture the human face with a depth and emotion that made viewers feel they knew the subject personally. His landscapes seemed to breathe. His still lives looked good enough to eat. Thomas took these paintings and presented them as his own work. He showed them to his father first, who was pleased to see his son finally succeeding at something. Then he showed them to family, friends, and neighbors. Word began to spread through the county about young Thomas Ashworth's remarkable talent. People came to the plantation to see his work. They commissioned portraits and landscapes. They paid good money for paintings that Thomas had not touched except to sign his name. By 1853, Thomas Ashworth was the most talked about painter in South Carolina. Critics in Charleston called him a prodigy. Newspapers published glowing reviews. He was invited to exhibit his work in galleries where the wealthy and powerful came to admire and purchase. No one suspected the truth. Why would they? The idea that an enslaved child could produce such sophisticated art was unthinkable to them. Their entire worldview was built on the belief that black people were inferior, incapable of higher thought or refined creativity. The paintings in front of their eyes should have been proof that this belief was wrong. But they never even considered the possibility. Gideon watched all of this from the shadows. He was not allowed to attend the exhibitions. He was not mentioned in the reviews. When wealthy visitors came to the plantation to meet the famous young artist, Gideon was kept out of sight, locked in the basement or sent to work in the far fields. His existence was a secret that Thomas guarded carefully. But secrets have a way of creating pressure, and the pressure was building inside Gideon. Every painting he created was a piece of his soul that he was forced to give away. He painted portraits of men who owned other human beings. He painted landscapes of plantations where people like him worked until they died. He painted scenes of a world that treated him as property while it celebrated his work. And every time Thomas signed his name to one of these paintings, something inside Gideon twisted a little tighter. The arrangement had other costs as well. Thomas had promised protection, but his promise had conditions. If Gideon refused to paint, or if his work was not good enough, Thomas reminded him of what could happen. There was a younger girl in the quarters named Mercy. She was 7 years old, the daughter of a woman who had been sold away 2 years earlier. Gideon had taken the girl under his care, treating her like the little sister he had never had. He taught her to read using marks in the dirt, just as Cora had once taught him. He made sure she ate enough. He protected her from the older boys who sometimes caused trouble. Thomas knew about Mercy. He knew that she was the one person Gideon cared about more than himself. And he used this knowledge as a weapon. If Gideon ever disobeyed, if he ever told anyone the truth, Mercy would be the first to suffer. Thomas would make sure she was sold to the worst plantation he could find, somewhere deep in the Mississippi Delta where conditions were known to be brutal. He described this threat in detail, making sure Gideon understood exactly what was at stake. So Gideon painted. He painted with fear in his heart and chains on his soul. And with each painting, his hatred grew. In the spring of 1854, a new figure arrived in the county. His name was Ezra Finch, and he presented himself as a traveling salesman of art supplies. He was a thin man in his 40s with spectacles and a gentle manner. He visited plantations and wealthy homes throughout the region, selling brushes, pigments, canvases, and other materials. He seemed harmless, just another businessman trying to make a living. But Ezra Finch was not what he appeared to be. He was a member of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, and his art supply business was a cover for his real work, gathering information about the conditions of enslaved people and helping to organize escapes through the Underground Railroad. Ezra had heard about Thomas Ashworth's remarkable paintings. The work had attracted attention even in the North, where critics were impressed by the technical skill on display. Ezra was curious. He made his way to the Ashworth plantation in April of 1854, carrying cases of supplies and a letter of introduction from a merchant in Charleston. Thomas received him warmly. He was always happy to meet someone who appreciated art, and he needed supplies for his latest commission, a large historical painting that had been ordered by the governor of South Carolina himself. It was to be unveiled at a special ceremony in June, a celebration of Southern culture and achievement. Thomas had already planned out the scene in his mind. It would be his masterpiece, the painting that would cement his reputation forever. Of course, Gideon would be the one to actually create it. Ezra spent several days at the plantation, observing everything he could. He noticed the way Thomas talked about his work without ever mentioning the actual process of creation. He noticed the lack of paint stains on Thomas's hands, the absence of the telltale signs that mark a working artist. He noticed the way certain areas of the big house were kept off limits to visitors. And he noticed a young black boy who appeared briefly one evening carrying supplies from a basement door to a storage area. Something about the boy caught Ezra's attention. It was the way he moved, the way he looked at the world around him. There was an intensity in his eyes that did not match his lowered head and shuffling steps. Ezra had seen that look before, in people who were hiding something important. One evening, Ezra excused himself from dinner early, claiming a headache. Instead of going to his room, he made his way quietly through the house to the basement stairs. He moved slowly, careful not to make any sound. At the bottom of the stairs, he found a door that was slightly ajar. Warm light spilled out from inside. He pushed the door open and stepped into a small room that had been converted into an artist's studio. There were canvases stacked against the walls. There were shelves filled with pigments and oils. There was an easel in the center of the room where a large painting was taking shape. And standing before that easel, brush in hand, was the boy he had seen earlier. Gideon spun around when he heard the door. His eyes went wide with terror. He dropped the brush, and for a moment both of them stood frozen, staring at each other across the cramped space. Ezra raised his hand slowly, showing that he meant no harm. He spoke in a low voice, calm and steady. He told Gideon that he was not going to hurt him. He was not going to tell anyone what he had seen. He just wanted to understand. It took a long time for Gideon to speak. 3 years of secrecy and fear had taught him to trust no one. But there was something in Ezra's manner that was different from the white men Gideon had known. There was no condescension, no hidden cruelty. There was only curiosity and something that looked almost like respect. Slowly, carefully, the story came out. Gideon told Ezra everything. The drawings behind the smokehouse, Thomas finding him, the arrangement that had trapped him for 3 years, the threats against mercy, the hundreds of hours spent creating paintings that would bear another man's name. When Gideon finished, Ezra was silent for a long moment. He looked at the painting on the easel, a landscape that captured the light of early morning with breathtaking accuracy. He looked at the stacks of canvases, each one representing hours of skilled labor by a child who received no credit and no compensation. He looked at Gideon, a 17-year-old boy who had been robbed of everything except his talent. Then Ezra made a decision that would set in motion the events of that night in Charleston. He told Gideon about the Underground Railroad. He explained that there were people throughout the South who helped enslaved people escape to freedom in the North and in Canada. He said that he could help Gideon and Mercy get out, could arrange for them to be taken to Philadelphia, where they could start new lives as free people. Gideon listened carefully, but when Ezra finished, he shook his head. Running away was not enough. If he disappeared, Thomas would continue to use the paintings that had already been created. He would continue to claim credit for work that was not his. He would face no consequences for what he had done. The truth would never be known. Gideon had been thinking about this for a long time. In the lonely hours he spent in that basement studio, his mind had turned over and over on the injustice of his situation. He had dreamed of revenge, of finding some way to expose Thomas for the fraud he was, but he had never seen a way to do it safely. Now, with Ezra's help, a plan began to form. The governor's commission was the key. It would be the most important painting of Thomas's career, unveiled at a ceremony attended by the most powerful people in the South. All eyes would be on that painting. If there was ever a moment to reveal the truth, that was it. Gideon told Ezra what he wanted to do. He would create the painting that Thomas had promised the governor. But it would not be the painting Thomas expected. It would be something else entirely. It would be a testament to the truth, a visual confession that could not be denied or explained away. Ezra saw the fire in Gideon's eyes. He understood that this young man had been pushed beyond the limits of what any person should have to endure. He understood the desire for justice that burned in him. And after a long conversation that lasted until the early hours of the morning, Ezra agreed to help. Over the next 2 months, the plan took shape. Gideon would create 2 paintings. The first was the one Thomas had ordered, a grand historical scene depicting the founding of Charleston. Gideon worked on this painting openly, letting Thomas see his progress, keeping him satisfied and unsuspecting. The second painting was created in secret. Gideon worked on it late at night after Thomas had gone to sleep. He hid it behind the larger canvas, covering it with cloth whenever he heard footsteps approaching. This painting was different from anything he had ever created before. It was not beautiful in the traditional sense. It was not the kind of art that wealthy people hung in their parlors. It was a statement, a declaration, a weapon made of paint and canvas. The centerpiece of the painting was a self-portrait. Gideon had never painted himself before. Thomas had never asked for such a thing, and Gideon had never thought to create one on his own. But now he stood before a small mirror that Ezra had smuggled into the studio and studied his own face for the first time as an artist studies a subject. What he saw surprised him. He had expected to see a victim, a boy broken by years of servitude and exploitation. But the face that looked back at him was strong. The eyes were fierce. There was a power there that years of bondage had not been able to destroy. He painted that power. He painted himself not as a slave, but as an artist, a creator, a human being with dignity and worth. He held a brush in one hand like a sword. Behind him, flames consumed a plantation that looked very much like the Ashworth estate. And scattered throughout the painting, hidden in the details, were the faces of everyone Gideon had known in his 17 years of life. Korah, who had raised him. Ezekiel, who had warned him. Ruth, his mother, reconstructed from Korah's descriptions in his own imagination. Mercy, the little girl he had sworn to protect. In the corner of the painting, clearly visible, was a signature. Gideon, not Thomas Ashworth. Gideon. A single word that would tell the world everything. As June approached, the preparations for the governor's ceremony intensified. Thomas was busy with social obligations, attending parties, and giving interviews about his upcoming masterpiece. He visited the basement studio less frequently, trusting that Gideon would complete the work as ordered. This gave Gideon more time to work on his secret painting, adding layers of meaning and detail that would only become clear upon close examination. Ezra Finch had left the plantation weeks earlier, but he remained in contact through a network of trusted allies. He had arranged for several members of the Underground Railroad to be present in Charleston on the night of the ceremony. If something went wrong, if Gideon and Mercy needed to escape quickly, there would be people ready to help them disappear into the night. On June 15th, 2 days before the ceremony, Thomas came to the basement studio to inspect the finished painting. He pulled back the cloth that covered the large canvas and looked at what Gideon had created. It was magnificent. The scene depicted the founding fathers of Charleston standing on the shore, looking out over the harbor as ships arrived from across the ocean. The colors were rich and vibrant. The composition was perfect. Every face was rendered with lifelike precision. It was exactly what the governor had ordered, exactly what Thomas had promised. Thomas smiled. He clapped Gideon on the shoulder in a rare gesture of approval. This painting would make him famous throughout the entire South. He said it would be the crowning achievement of his career. He left the studio in high spirits, already imagining the praise he would receive. He did not see the second painting hidden behind the larger canvas. He did not notice the look in Gideon's eyes as he watched him leave. The day of reckoning was approaching. On the morning of June 17, 1854, the painting was loaded onto a wagon and transported to Charleston under heavy guard. It was wrapped in layers of cloth to protect it from the elements, and Thomas himself rode alongside it, anxious to ensure that nothing happened to his masterpiece. Gideon was left behind at the plantation, as always. He was not invited to the ceremony. He was not acknowledged in any way. But Ezra Finch had made other arrangements. That evening, as the sun began to set over Charleston, Gideon slipped away from the plantation. He carried nothing with him except the clothes on his back and a small cloth bag containing his secret painting, carefully rolled to protect it from damage. Mercy was with him, holding his hand tightly as they made their way through the woods to a meeting point where a wagon waited. The driver was a free black man named Samuel, who made his living transporting goods between plantations. He was also a conductor on the Underground Railroad, and he had helped dozens of people escape to freedom over the years. He did not ask questions when Gideon and Mercy climbed into the back of his wagon. He simply nodded and clicked his tongue to set the horses moving. The journey to Charleston took several hours. They traveled on back roads to avoid being seen, and they stopped twice when Samuel spotted patrols in the distance. But by the time the stars appeared in the sky, they had reached the outskirts of the city. The Planters' Hotel was lit up like a palace. Lanterns hung from every window, and the sound of music and laughter spilled out into the street. Carriages lined the block as wealthy guests arrived for the ceremony. Inside, over 200 people had gathered in the grand ballroom, where refreshments were being served and anticipation was building for the unveiling of Thomas Ashworth's masterpiece. The painting stood at the front of the room, covered by a large velvet curtain. Thomas stood beside it, accepting congratulations from admirers who had not yet even seen the work. He was dressed in his finest suit, his hair perfectly combed, his smile wide and confident. He had no idea that at that very moment, his entire world was about to collapse. Ezra Finch was in the crowd, dressed as a server. He had obtained a uniform from an ally who worked at the hotel, and he moved through the room carrying a tray of champagne glasses, his eyes scanning for the moment when the plan would be set in motion. At exactly 8 o'clock, the governor of South Carolina stepped up to a small podium beside the covered painting. The room fell silent. He gave a short speech about the importance of art in celebrating Southern culture and heritage. He praised Thomas Ashworth as an example of young Southern talent, a credit to his family and his state. Then he reached for the cord that would pull back the velvet curtain and reveal the painting to the assembled guests. He pulled the cord. The curtain fell away. And for a moment that seemed to last forever, no one in that room made a sound. The painting they saw was not the one Thomas had inspected 2 days earlier. It was not the grand historical scene depicting the founding of Charleston. It was something else entirely. A young black man stared out from the canvas, his eyes fierce and unyielding. He held a brush in his hand like a weapon. Behind him, flames consumed a plantation, and throughout the painting, hidden in the smoke and shadows, were dozens of faces. The faces of the enslaved, the forgotten, the erased. In the corner of the painting, clearly visible to everyone in the room, was a single word, Gideon. The silence broke like a wave. People began to murmur, then to shout. Thomas Ashworth stood frozen, his face draining of color as he stared at the painting that had somehow replaced his own. The governor stepped back, confusion written across his features. Women gasped and covered their mouths. Men demanded explanations that no one could give. And in the back of the room, unseen by anyone who mattered, Ezra Finch smiled. The chaos that erupted in the grand ballroom of the Planters Hotel on the night of June 17, 1854, would be talked about in Charleston for decades. But in those first moments after the curtain fell, time itself seemed to slow down. Every person in that room was frozen, their minds struggling to make sense of what their eyes were showing them. Thomas Ashworth was the first to move. He lunged toward the painting, his hands reaching out as if to tear it from the easel. But before he could touch the canvas, 2 men grabbed his arms and held him back. They were friends of his father, men who had known Thomas since he was a child. They did not understand what was happening, but they understood that destroying the painting in front of the governor and 200 witnesses would only make things worse. Thomas struggled against their grip, his face twisted with rage and fear. He shouted that this was not his painting, that someone had switched them, that there had been a terrible mistake. But even as the words left his mouth, he could see that no one believed him. The painting in front of them was clearly the work of the same hand that had created all of Thomas's previous pieces. The brushwork was identical. The use of color was the same. The technical skill was unmistakable. The only difference was the subject matter and the signature in the corner. Governor James Hopkins stood at the podium, his prepared remarks about Southern culture and artistic achievement still clutched in his hand. He was a politician, a man who had spent his career navigating difficult situations, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for this moment. He looked from the painting to Thomas to the confused faces of his guests, and he made a decision. He called for order. His voice was loud and commanding, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. The murmuring in the room subsided, though it did not disappear entirely. The governor announced that there had clearly been some kind of confusion, and that the evening's program would be suspended while the matter was investigated. He asked everyone to remain calm and to enjoy the refreshments while he and a few trusted advisors sorted out what had happened. It was a reasonable response to an unreasonable situation, but it came too late to contain the damage. Among the guests that evening were 3 newspaper reporters. They had been invited to cover what was supposed to be a celebration of Southern art and culture. Instead, they found themselves witnesses to something far more newsworthy. One of them, a young man named William Porter who worked for the Charleston Mercury, had been standing near the front of the room when the curtain fell. He had seen everything clearly. He had seen the painting, and he had seen Thomas Ashworth's reaction, and he had already begun composing his story in his head. While the governor attempted to restore order, Porter slipped out of the ballroom through a side door. He made his way to the Mercury's offices on Broad Street, where he spent the next 3 hours writing the article that would appear in the morning edition. The headline would read, "Ashworth Painting Scandal Rocks Governor's Gala." The story would describe the mysterious painting, the name signed in the corner, and the obvious distress of the young artist who had supposedly created it. It would ask questions that demanded answers. But the real story was still unfolding back at the hotel. Thomas had been taken to a private room on the second floor, away from the prying eyes of the guests. His father, Cornelius, had been summoned from the plantation and was expected to arrive within a few hours. In the meantime, Thomas paced back and forth like a caged animal, his mind racing through the possibilities. How had this happened? He had inspected the painting himself just 2 days earlier. It had been the Charleston founding scene, exactly as he had ordered. The painting that now hung in the ballroom was completely different. Someone had switched them. But who and how? The painting had been under guard during the entire journey from the plantation to the hotel. No one could have accessed it without being seen, unless the switch had happened before the painting left the plantation. Thomas stopped pacing. His eyes widened as the realization hit him. Gideon. It had to be Gideon. The boy must have created 2 paintings and somehow hidden the second one inside the first, or he had found a way to replace the canvas after Thomas's inspection. However he had done it, Gideon was responsible for this disaster. A cold fury settled over Thomas. He had given that boy everything. He had protected him, provided for him, kept him safe from the harsh realities of plantation life. And this was how he was repaid, with public humiliation, with the destruction of everything Thomas had built. Thomas called for his personal servant, a man named James, who had accompanied him to Charleston. He gave James specific instructions. Ride back to the plantation immediately and find Gideon. Do not let him out of your sight. When Cornelius arrives, tell him what has happened and ask him to bring Gideon to Charleston. Thomas would deal with the boy himself. James left immediately, pushing his horse hard through the night. But when he arrived at the Ashworth plantation just before dawn, he discovered that Gideon was gone. So was the young girl called Mercy. Their beds had not been slept in. No one in the quarters knew where they had gone, or if they knew, they were not saying. The hunt began. Meanwhile, Gideon and Mercy were miles away, hidden in the back of a wagon that was making its way north along roads that few travelers used. Samuel, the driver, had been moving escaped slaves along this route for years. He knew every safe house, every sympathetic farmer, every hidden path through the woods. He knew how to avoid the patrols that searched for runaways and the bounty hunters who made their living capturing them. For the first several hours of the journey, Gideon did not speak. He sat in the darkness of the covered wagon, holding Mercy close, his mind replaying the events of the evening over and over. He had not been there to see the painting unveiled. He had not witnessed Thomas's reaction or the confusion of the guests, but he could imagine it. He had thought about this moment for months, picturing how it would unfold, wondering if his plan would actually work. Now it had worked. The painting was out in the world. His name was signed on it for everyone to see. The truth had been revealed, at least partially. But Gideon knew that the revelation was only the beginning. What came next would determine whether any of it mattered. Mercy fell asleep against his shoulder, exhausted from the stress and the long journey. She was 8 years old now, too young to fully understand what was happening, but old enough to sense the danger they were in. Gideon had explained to her that they were going somewhere safe, somewhere far away where no one could hurt them. He had not told her about the painting or the ceremony or the revenge he had planned for years. Those were burdens too heavy for a child to carry. As the wagon rolled on through the darkness, Gideon allowed himself to think about the future for the first time in his life. In all his years on the plantation, he had never imagined a life beyond its boundaries. The future had always been a closed door, something that existed for other people but not for him. Now that door was opening, just a crack, and he could see light on the other side. He thought about what he would do if he made it to freedom. He would paint, of course. He would create art that was truly his own. Art that he could sign with his own name and show to the world. But he would also teach. He would find other children like himself, children whose gifts had been buried by the circumstances of their birth, and he would help them discover what they were capable of. These were the dreams that sustained him through the long night journey. They were the stars he navigated by when the path ahead seemed impossible. Back in Charleston, the morning brought new revelations. William Porter's article in the Mercury was read by thousands of people over their breakfast tables. The story spread quickly, passed from person to person, discussed in drawing rooms and on street corners. By noon, it had reached the offices of newspapers in Columbia, Savannah, and Richmond. By evening, telegraph wires were carrying abbreviated versions of the story to New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. The reaction in the North was very different from the reaction in the South. Northern newspapers, particularly those with abolitionist sympathies, seized on the story as evidence of the corruption at the heart of the slave system. Here was a young enslaved person of obvious genius, forced to create art that a white man claimed as his own. It was exploitation in its purest form. They argued the theft not just of labor, but of creativity and identity. Southern newspapers took a different approach. They questioned the validity of the story, suggesting that it was a hoax designed to embarrass the South. They pointed out that no one had actually seen this mysterious Gideon create anything. The painting itself, they argued, proved nothing. Anyone could sign a name on a canvas. The whole affair was probably the work of Northern agitators trying to stir up trouble. But there were also Southerners who believed the story, or at least suspected it might be true. These were people who had seen Thomas Ashworth's paintings and had always sensed something slightly off about them. The work was technically brilliant, but it lacked the passion and personality that usually marked a true artist. Now they understood why. The paintings had not come from Thomas's heart, because they had not come from Thomas at all. Cornelius Ashworth arrived in Charleston the day after the ceremony, his face grim and his temper barely contained. He had built his reputation over decades of careful management and political maneuvering. Now his son had become the center of a scandal that threatened to destroy everything. The family name, which had commanded respect throughout the state, was suddenly a subject of ridicule and suspicion. Cornelius met with his son in the private room at the Planters Hotel. The conversation that followed was not recorded, but servants who passed by the door reported hearing raised voices and the sound of furniture being overturned. When Cornelius emerged an hour later, his face was pale and his hands were shaking. He refused to speak to any of the reporters who had gathered outside the hotel, pushing past them without a word. Later that day, Cornelius issued a public statement through his lawyer. The statement acknowledged that the painting displayed at the governor's ceremony was not the one that had been commissioned. It suggested that the painting had been switched by unknown parties, possibly abolitionists, seeking to embarrass the Ashworth family and undermine Southern institutions. It made no mention of Gideon or any enslaved person. It promised a full investigation and asked the public to withhold judgment until all the facts were known. The statement satisfied no one. Critics in the North dismissed it as a cover-up. Supporters in the South found it evasive and unconvincing. And those who had begun to suspect the truth saw it as confirmation of their suspicions. The investigation that followed was thorough but ultimately inconclusive. Investigators interviewed servants at the plantation, workers at the hotel, and everyone who had been involved in transporting the painting from one location to the other. They found no evidence that the painting had been switched during transit. The security had been too tight, the guards too vigilant. The only explanation that made sense was that the switch had occurred before the painting left the plantation. This led the investigators to the basement studio where Thomas had claimed to work. What they found there was revealing. The room was clearly set up for serious artistic work, with professional equipment and supplies that must have cost a small fortune. But there were no personal touches, no sketches or studies that would indicate an artist's process. Most tellingly, there were no paint stains on any of Thomas's clothing, no trace of pigment under his fingernails. For someone who supposedly spent hours every day painting, he was remarkably clean. The investigators also spoke with other enslaved people on the plantation. Most refused to say anything, too afraid of the consequences to speak. But one person did talk. Her name was Cora. She was 73 years old now, the woman who had raised Gideon from infancy after his mother died. She had watched him grow up, had seen his gift emerge, had warned him to keep it hidden. She had witnessed Thomas's discovery of the boy's talent and the arrangement that followed. And she had kept silent for 3 years, bound by fear and the need to protect the child she loved. But Gideon was gone now. He had escaped, had made it out, had exposed the truth for the whole world to see. And Cora was too old and too tired to be afraid anymore. She told the investigators everything. She told them about Gideon's drawings behind the smokehouse. She told them about Thomas finding the boy and forcing him to work in secret. She told them about the hundreds of hours Gideon had spent in the basement creating paintings that Thomas claimed as his own. She told them about the threats against mercy, the constant fear, the stolen credit, and the stolen years. When she finished, the lead investigator sat in silence for a long moment. He was a Southerner, a man who had grown up believing in the rightness of the system that held people like Cora in bondage. But he was also a man who valued truth. And the truth he had just heard shook something loose inside him. The investigator's report was submitted to the governor 2 weeks after the ceremony. It confirmed what many had suspected. The paintings attributed to Thomas Ashworth had been created by an enslaved person named Gideon, who had been coerced into working under threat of violence. The report recommended that Thomas be censured and that his previous works be reattributed to their true creator. The report was never made public. Governor Hopkins read it once, then locked it in a drawer in his desk. The political implications were too dangerous, the social consequences too unpredictable. If the report became public, it would provide ammunition to abolitionists across the country. It would undermine the carefully constructed argument that enslaved people were incapable of higher thought or artistic achievement. It would raise questions about how many other talents were being suppressed, how many other geniuses were being forced to work in anonymity. The governor could not allow that to happen. So the report stayed hidden, and the official position remained that the affair was a hoax perpetrated by outside agitators. But the truth has a way of spreading even when powerful people try to contain it. In the weeks that followed, more details emerged through unofficial channels. Newspaper reporters continued to investigate, particularly in the North, where editors were eager to publish anything that reflected badly on the slave system. Former visitors to the Ashworth plantation came forward with observations that suddenly made sense: the paint-free hands, the vague answers about artistic process, the way Thomas always changed the subject when asked about specific techniques. And then there were the people in the quarters. The enslaved people of the Ashworth plantation had watched the drama unfold from a distance. They had seen the investigators come and go. They had heard rumors about what Cora had told them. And they had made a decision. They would not let Gideon's story be buried. One by one, they began to share what they knew with anyone who would listen. Traveling preachers who visited the plantation heard fragments of the story and carried it to other plantations. Merchants who came to trade heard whispers and repeated them in towns throughout the county. Enslaved people who were hired out to other farms spread the word to their new communities. Within a month, the story of Gideon, the enslaved artist whose work had been stolen by his master's son, was known throughout the South. It was told in different versions with different details, but the core of the story remained the same. A black child had been gifted with extraordinary talent. A white man had exploited that talent for his own glory. And in the end, the truth had been revealed in the most dramatic way possible. For the people in the quarters, Gideon became a symbol. He represented the countless talents that had been suppressed, the countless achievements that had been stolen, the countless lives that had been diminished by a system designed to treat human beings as property. His story gave them hope that someday the truth about all of them would be known. Thomas Ashworth did not fare well in the aftermath of the scandal. His reputation, which had been built entirely on work that was not his own, collapsed completely. The galleries that had displayed his paintings quietly removed them from their walls. The critics who had praised his genius pretended they had never heard of him. The society families who had welcomed him into their homes suddenly had no room on their guest lists. Thomas tried to continue painting, to prove that he had talent of his own, but the work he produced was mediocre at best, lacking the spark that had made his previous paintings so remarkable. He submitted pieces to galleries under a false name, hoping for an honest evaluation, and was rejected every time. The failure destroyed him. Within a year, Thomas had developed a serious drinking problem. He spent his days locked in his room, surrounded by half-finished canvases and empty bottles. His father tried to help, sending doctors and advisors, but nothing worked. Thomas had built his entire identity on being an artist, and now he knew that he had never been one. The knowledge ate away at him like a cancer. In the spring of 1856, Thomas Ashworth boarded a ship bound for Europe. He told his family he needed time away, a chance to start fresh in a place where no one knew his name or his history. He settled in a small town in southern France, far from the art world that had once celebrated him. He lived there for the next 30 years, working odd jobs and drinking himself slowly to death. He never painted again. Cornelius Ashworth managed to salvage some of the family's reputation through careful political maneuvering and generous donations to the right causes. But the shadow of the scandal never fully lifted. When he died in 1861, just as the Civil War was beginning, the obituaries mentioned his business success and his political connections. They did not mention his son or the artist who had worked in his basement. And what of Gideon? The journey north was long and dangerous. Samuel, the wagon driver, took Gideon and Mercy along a route that passed through 3 states, stopping at safe houses operated by members of the Underground Railroad. They traveled mostly at night, hiding during the day in barns, cellars, and sometimes in the woods when no shelter was available. There were close calls. Once, a patrol of slave catchers passed within 50 yards of where they were hiding, and Gideon had to cover Mercy's mouth to keep her from crying out in fear. Another time, they were stopped at a bridge by a deputy who asked to search the wagon. Samuel talked his way out of it, claiming to be transporting supplies for a church in the next county, but Gideon had already prepared himself to run if necessary. After 2 weeks of travel, they crossed into Pennsylvania. The relief Gideon felt when Samuel told him they were on free soil was unlike anything he had experienced before. He had heard about freedom his entire life, had dreamed about it, had tried to imagine what it would feel like. But the reality was beyond anything he had imagined. It was not just the absence of chains or overseers. It was the presence of possibility, the sense that his life was now his own to shape. They continued north to Philadelphia, where Ezra Finch was waiting for them. Ezra had returned to the city immediately after the ceremony in Charleston, knowing that he would be suspected if he stayed in the South too long. He had arranged for Gideon and Mercy to stay with a Quaker family in the Germantown neighborhood, a community known for its anti-slavery sympathies and its willingness to help escaped slaves. The family's name was Morrison. Jacob and Sarah Morrison were in their 50s, childless, and deeply committed to the abolitionist cause. They welcomed Gideon and Mercy into their home as if they were long-lost relatives. Sarah made sure they had warm clothes and good food. Jacob helped Gideon find work as an assistant at a local print shop, where his artistic skills proved valuable. For the first time in his life, Gideon was paid for his labor. He received actual money that he could spend as he pleased. It was a small amount by most standards, but to Gideon it represented something priceless, the acknowledgement that his work had value, that he had value. He continued to paint in his spare time. Jacob Morrison set up a small studio in the attic of the house, equipping it with supplies that Ezra Finch helped to purchase. There, by the light of candles and oil lamps, Gideon created the first works that were truly his own. They were not commissioned by anyone, not intended for any particular purpose. They were simply expressions of what he felt and what he had experienced. The first painting he completed in freedom was a portrait of his mother. He had been painting Ruth's face from memory for years, ever since he was old enough to hold a brush. But this version was different. It was larger, more detailed, more alive than anything he had created before. He painted her not as a slave, but as a queen, with a dignity and grace that the institution of slavery could never diminish. When he finished the painting, he hung it on the wall of the attic studio. Every day before he began work, he would look at it and remember where he had come from. And every day he would pick up his brush and continue creating, knowing that he was doing what she would have wanted him to do. Mercy adapted to freedom more easily than Gideon had expected. Children are resilient, and she was young enough that the trauma of plantation life had not yet hardened into permanent scars. She enrolled in a school for black children run by the African Methodist Episcopal Church, where she learned to read and write and discovered that she had a gift for mathematics. Sarah Morrison became like a grandmother to her, teaching her to cook and sew and navigate the world of free black society in Philadelphia. Gideon watched Mercy flourish and felt a satisfaction that went beyond anything his art had ever given him. He had promised to protect her, and he had kept that promise. Whatever else happened in his life, he would always have that. The story of the Charleston painting continued to spread throughout 1854 and 1855. Northern newspapers published detailed accounts of the scandal, and abolitionist speakers incorporated it into their lectures as an example of the injustices inherent in slavery. Frederick Douglass himself mentioned the case in a speech in Boston, calling Gideon's work a testament to the talent that slavery sought to suppress. Gideon followed these developments from Philadelphia, reading every newspaper account he could find. He felt a mixture of pride and frustration. Pride that his story was being told, that people were learning about what had happened. Frustration that he could not speak for himself, could not step forward and claim the recognition he deserved. The problem was that he was still technically a fugitive. Under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, escaped slaves could be captured and returned to their owners, even in free states. Cornelius Ashworth had posted a reward for Gideon's return, describing him as valuable property that had been stolen. If Gideon revealed his location, he would be putting himself and everyone who had helped him at risk. So he remained in the shadows, creating art that no one outside his small circle would see, waiting for the day when it would be safe to step into the light. That day came sooner than he expected. In 1857, a group of wealthy abolitionists in Boston organized an exhibition called The Art of Freedom. The exhibition was designed to showcase the work of black artists, both free and formerly enslaved, as a way of demonstrating the creative capacity that slavery sought to deny. The organizers reached out to Ezra Finch, asking if he knew of any artists who might contribute. Ezra told them about Gideon. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. The organizers wanted Gideon's work in the exhibition. More than that, they wanted Gideon himself. They promised to provide protection, to hire lawyers who would challenge any attempt to capture him under the Fugitive Slave Act, to mobilize public opinion in his defense if necessary. It was a risk, a significant risk, but Gideon decided to take it. In October of 1857, Gideon Vance walked into the Boston Athenaeum where The Art of Freedom was being held. He was 20 years old, a tall young man with serious eyes and paint-stained hands. He wore a suit that the Morrisons had bought for him, the first suit he had ever owned. And on the walls of the gallery hung 12 of his paintings, each one signed with his name. The exhibition was a sensation. Critics praised the work for its technical skill and emotional depth. Visitors marveled at the range of subjects, landscapes, portraits, historical scenes, all rendered with a mastery that seemed impossible for someone so young. And when they learned the story behind the paintings, the story of the enslaved boy who had been forced to work in secret for years, their admiration only grew. Gideon gave interviews to newspapers and magazines. He spoke at abolitionist meetings and church gatherings. He told his story again and again, not for his own glory, but for all the others whose stories would never be told. He became a symbol of what was possible when talent was allowed to flourish, and a reminder of what was lost when it was suppressed. The legal challenges that the organizers had feared never materialized. Cornelius Ashworth had died the previous year, and his estate was in disarray. No one was willing to invest the time and money required to pursue a fugitive slave claim in a hostile northern court. Gideon was, for all practical purposes, free. He used his freedom wisely. With money earned from the sale of his paintings, he established a small art school for black children in Philadelphia. The school operated out of a rented building in the Northern Liberties neighborhood, offering free instruction to anyone who wanted to learn. Gideon taught many of the classes himself, passing on the techniques he had developed during all those years in the basement studio. The school was a success. Within a few years, it had produced several notable artists who went on to careers of their own. Gideon took no credit for their achievements, insisting that the talent had been there all along, waiting to be discovered. He was simply providing the opportunity that he himself had been denied. In 1861, the Civil War began. Gideon watched the conflict unfold with a mixture of hope and dread. Hope that the war would finally end the institution that had shaped his life. Dread for the suffering he knew it would cause, for the lives that would be lost before the fighting was done. When the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in January of 1863, Gideon created a painting to commemorate the moment. It showed a group of enslaved people looking up at the sky, where the words of the proclamation were written in letters of gold. Their faces expressed a range of emotions: joy, disbelief, relief, and a cautious hope. It was one of the most powerful images he ever created, and it was reproduced widely in newspapers and magazines throughout the North. In April of 1865, the war ended. Slavery was abolished, and Gideon Vance, at 25 years old, was truly free at last. He could have stayed in Philadelphia, could have continued to build his reputation as an artist and teacher. The art world was eager to celebrate him, to claim him as one of their own. But Gideon felt the pull of something stronger than fame or success. He went back to South Carolina. The journey south was very different from his escape 11 years earlier. He traveled by train, sitting in the colored car, but traveling openly without fear of capture. He watched the landscape change as he moved from the industrial north to the devastated south, seeing the ruins of a world that had once seemed permanent. The Ashworth plantation was almost unrecognizable. The big house had been burned during the war, and only its brick foundations remained. The fields were overgrown. The outbuildings collapsed. The quarters where Gideon had grown up were empty, their former residents scattered across the country. Gideon found what he was looking for in a small cemetery at the edge of the property. It was the burial ground for the enslaved people who had lived and died on the plantation, marked by simple wooden crosses that had mostly rotted away. He searched among the unmarked graves until he found the one he was looking for. Ruth. His mother. She had been buried here 25 years ago in an unmarked grave that no one had tended. Gideon knelt in the dirt and wept. He wept for the mother he had never known, for the father he would never meet, for the childhood that had been stolen from him. He wept for all the years of secrecy and fear, all the paintings signed with another man's name, all the talent that had been used to glorify a system that treated him as property. And when he had no more tears, he took out a small painting that he had brought with him from Philadelphia. It was the portrait of Ruth that hung in his attic studio, the one he had created in the first months of his freedom. He had made a smaller copy to leave at her grave, a gift that he should have been able to give her in life. The painting showed a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Wings emerged from her back, lifting her toward a sky filled with stars. And at the bottom, Gideon had written a single line: "You gave me these hands. I painted freedom." He placed the painting on the grave and covered it with a flat stone to protect it from the elements. Then he stood and looked around at the ruined plantation, the collapsed buildings, the overgrown fields. Everything that had once seemed so powerful, so permanent, so indestructible, was now just rubble and weeds. But Gideon was still here. His art was still here. His story was still being told. The masters had fallen. The truth had risen in their place. Gideon returned to Philadelphia and continued his work for another 40 years. He painted thousands of canvases, taught hundreds of students, and became one of the most respected artists of his generation. His work is now held in museums across the country, each piece signed with the name he had claimed for himself on that night in Charleston. He married in 1870, a woman named Elizabeth who had been a teacher at his school. They had 3 children, all of whom survived to adulthood. Mercy stayed close to the family, eventually becoming a mathematics teacher herself and helping to run the school's administrative affairs. Gideon died in 1905 at the age of 65. His obituary in the Philadelphia Inquirer called him one of the great American artists of the 19th century, and noted that his early work, created in slavery, demonstrated the indomitable nature of human genius. At his funeral, his oldest son read a passage that Gideon had written late in his life. It was not about art or fame or the scandal that had made him famous. It was about something simpler and more profound. "They took everything from me," Gideon had written. "They took my mother and my father. They took my childhood and my freedom. They took my work and put another man's name on it. They tried to take my soul. But there was one thing they could never take. They could never take the truth of who I was. They could never take the vision in my eyes or the skill in my hands. They could never take the fire that burned inside me. I was a slave for 17 years. But I was an artist from the moment I was born. And I will be an artist until the moment I die. That is the one thing they could never steal from me. That is the one thing that was always mine." The lesson of Gideon Vance's life is not a complicated one. It is simply this: human beings are more than the circumstances of their birth. Talent, genius, creativity, these things do not care about skin color or social status. They emerge wherever they will, in the most unexpected places and the most unlikely people. For 2.5 centuries, the institution of slavery tried to deny this truth. It tried to convince the world that black people were inferior, incapable of higher thought or refined creativity. It used every tool at its disposal, from law to religion to violence, to enforce this lie. But the lie was never true. And people like Gideon Vance proved it was a lie every time they picked up a brush or a pen or an instrument. They proved it in the spirituals they sang and the stories they told. They proved it in the resistance they mounted and the escapes they engineered. They proved it simply by surviving, by maintaining their humanity in a system designed to strip it away. Gideon's revenge was not violent. He did not burn down the plantation or harm the people who had harmed him. His revenge was something more powerful and more lasting. His revenge was the truth. He created a painting that could not be denied. He signed his name where the world could see it. He forced the people who had stolen from him to confront what they had done. And in doing so, he claimed something that no one could ever take away: his identity, his legacy, his place in history. The Ashworth family is forgotten now. Thomas died in obscurity, and his paintings, the ones he actually created himself, are considered worthless. The plantation is a ruin, visited occasionally by historians but otherwise abandoned to the weeds and the weather. But Gideon Vance is remembered. His paintings hang in museums. His story is taught in schools. His name, the name he signed on that fateful night in Charleston, is known to millions of people who have never heard of the Ashworths or their plantation. That is the truest revenge of all. Not violence, not destruction, but survival. Not hatred, but creation. Not the defeat of enemies, but the triumph of truth. Gideon understood this better than anyone. He understood that the brush in his hand was more powerful than any weapon. He understood that the images he created would outlast the chains that bound him. He understood that art, true art, is an act of resistance that no oppressor can overcome. They tried to own him. They tried to silence him. They tried to steal his gift and claim it as their own. But in the end, Gideon Vance painted his way to freedom. And no one, then or now, has ever been able to explain how a boy with no training and no resources created works that rivaled the masters. Maybe there is no explanation. Maybe some gifts are too powerful to be contained, too bright to be hidden, too undeniable. Maybe Gideon was simply proof that the human spirit cannot be owned.